Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. This week we look at what is clearly the biggest single threat to Australia's national security. I refer, of course, to Tony Abbott speaking at the CPAC Australia conference earlier this year, as we try and figure out what the hell the federal government is actually up to with its foreign influence transparency scheme. We'll also have a good hard look at the Australian Research Council, that's always fun, and the grants it makes for research in the humanities. If you're triggered by post-Occidental rap and or the politics of food, you're going to love this. Then we reflect on the reaction to the IPA's Race Has No Place video, which was released just a little over a week ago. It's a terrific video, and the reaction says a lot about where the debate on the voice of Parliament and recognition currently sits in Australia. Finally, our always popular books and culture segment, the panel will be sharing what they've been reading, watching and listening to. This week we have some rippers. We have Joel Edgerton's take on the legend of Henry V and his erstwhile drinking buddy Falstaff. We have James C. Scott's book Against the Grain, which is about the earliest civilizations. David Watkin's classic book, well, I say that, I hadn't actually heard of it until Morgan told me. It's a classic book called Morality and Architecture. And then we also have a Netflix documentary on Bill Gates, which is scarily called Inside Bill's Brain. Don't forget, this podcast is brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a supporter, please do go to ipa.org.au and see how you can join or donate. And however you are watching or listening, whether it's on SoundCloud or YouTube or whatever, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on more wonderful episodes of Looking Forward. It's time now for me to introduce my fellow panellists. First of all, on the line from Spain, no less, my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott. How are you?
I'm very good. Good to have you, mate. Technology permitting, we'll see how we go. And on my left, IPA, left only geographically, IPA Research Fellow Morgan Begg.
Thanks, Scott.
And on my other side...
On the right.
On the right, definitely on the right, Dr. Bella de Brera, who, of course, is our Director of the Foundations of Western Civilization program.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the podcast. As mentioned, we are going to kick off today by talking about the imbroglio surrounding CPAP Australia. There's a wonderful interview with Andrew Cooper, the organiser of that event, on the Young IPA podcast, where he describes the letters that he's received from the Attorney General's Department requesting information and other things about the conference that he ran under the aegis of the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. This is our chance, and that's why we have Morgan here to tell us more about what this scheme is, what it's allegedly trying to do, and what it's actually doing.
Yeah.
Morgan, take it away.
Thanks, Scott. So the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act was introduced into Parliament in 2017, and its purported design is to introduce a registration scheme for those who seek to influence Australia's political process or lawmaking processes on behalf of a foreign power. So what that means is that foreign individuals and foreign institutions are still free to practice their influence in Australia, but they need to be registered onto a list. And what the minister said in his second reading speech was, our democracy holds dear the fundamental values of freedom, equality, the rule of law and mutual respect. This bill supports these values and asks that our foreign partners continue to engage with us, but in an open and transparent manner that will support the integrity of our democratic systems and processes.
So far, so good.
Yeah, not a great result so far on that front. As IPA research found in January this year that the provisions in the bill actually gave broad coercive powers to the department officials implementing it to unilaterally demand information from anyone who it suspects might be required to register under the scheme, and swept aside things like the privilege against self-incrimination and the obligation to observe natural justice. And what we've seen with Andrew Cooper and with Tony Abbott is that these powers have been used improperly. And I suppose it begs the question, well, what was the actual intent. Obviously these groups weren't. It wasn't the American Conservative Union, which was meant to be targeted by this. It was obviously totalitarian regimes who want to influence Australia's democracy for their own benefit, and the People's Republic of China would be the key sort of culprit in that.
But this was always the point that you did raise, as you say. You said this at the time, that if you write powers like this into legislation that overwhelm traditional fundamental legal rights, that you can't guarantee that the minister can say what they like. Ministers come and go, but this is what's on the statute books. If you have these sort of powers without any protections around them, you cannot guarantee how they are going to be used. And lo and behold, here they are being used in a way that the minister tells us it was never envisaged. But it doesn't mean that what the department is doing is outside the law at all. No one's actually claiming that.
No, that's right, and that's probably the most dangerous part. Sorry, Chris. I'll go ahead.
Isn't that a catastrophic claim? The idea that we never envisaged that the powers that we wrote would be used in this way. I cannot think of a better way to describe political or legislative incompetence than you write laws and don't envisage the way that powers could be used at all. We didn't expect. Now, so there's this debate, and this might be worth having a discussion about. The government seems to be arguing that, in fact, the laws are fine. What's happened is that they've been used inappropriately by the department itself.
A lack of common sense to date.
It sounds like
a lack of common sense.
That's the minister who said that.
That's the Attorney General.
It sounds like the argument that communism works. It just hasn't been applied properly yet.
Yes, that's right.
Sorry, Chris.
What we need is better communism.
Yes.
And we'll keep replacing bureaucrats until we find
until we get elected.
Yeah, exactly. But as opposed to actually having a look at this legislation and pointing out that I'm not a lawyer, and Morgan, you might have a position, be able to correct me on this. But my layperson's reading of the law is that the bureaucrats may well have been just faithfully implementing the legislation that they were given. So the legislation, and my understanding, it says if you're working on behalf of or using the communication of foreign principals. Now, foreign principals, then you have to register with the Attorney General's Department. Foreign principals includes foreign political organizations, and a foreign political organization includes a foreign organization that exists primarily to pursue political objectives. Now, if that's the case, why isn't the Conservative Political Action Conference one of those? Now, I understand, and Andrew Cooper made this point on the Young IPA podcast, that in fact, he wasn't acting on their behalf. They were invited. It was CPAC Australia, a separate entity, and I understand that. But on a bare reading of the law and a bare reading of the facts, why isn't this covered? I think this is a legitimate use of a terrible, terrible law.
Yeah, that's right, and that's the law has been written so broadly that, of course, this is within the scope of it, and what we're seeing is...
Well, this is also what the question is. Are the bureaucrats really being led, if you like? Famously, Senator Christina Keneally waged a one-woman campaign with an amazing absence of a groundswell of opinion behind her against CPAC and Tony Abbott's attendance and Nigel Farage and so on. Did the bureaucrats, Chris, do you think, actually just respond to that? It's like, the senators saying that we should have a look at this. I guess we better have a look at it.
Well, they well could have. I mean, but we can't blame bureaucrats if they're looking for legitimate violations of a law for finding out information wherever it is. And if Christine Keneally's intervention brought it to their attention, that may be regrettable, but that is also the case.
I'll just interrupt,
pointing
Chris,
out that there's
because the actual case with Cooper is that it didn't involve a violation of the law. What the department was doing was trying to ascertain whether they were satisfying their own curiosity as to whether he should or shouldn't register. The only potential criminal offence that would have arisen was if he didn't comply with the notice to provide the information. It's just a very bizarre situation. We're not dealing with illegal behaviour, really.
But not everyone wants to be on a government database. Not everyone wants to be on a government register. I mean, freedom actually...
Well, that's not the position of the Attorney General's Department.
No, clearly. I mean, as citizens, that's the whole point of this democracy that we live in, that you're actually meant to be able to go about your business.
Morgan mentioned actually in his op-ed last week a case in the US where they'd brought in a similar law and they'd targeted conservative organisations. Is that something that you can... do we know who else has received these letters? Is there a trend?
Well, according to reports, there's been... so Andrew Cooper was sent a notice, a formal notice under the provisions of the bill, and apparently he's been the only one so far, which is an indictment of the administration of this scheme. That we know of, that's right. But apparently, according to reports, 500 perhaps, letters of some kind have been sent advising people to consider whether they should or shouldn't register under the scheme. And I believe that's the kind of letter that Tony Abbott would have received. And
Fishing expedition.
I wonder do you think they sent one to get up?
Yeah, I do actually have a bit of a theory about this, and I will share it because it's a testable hypothesis.
Because you have a podcast.
Yeah, that's right. You got to fill an hour, so you might as well unburden yourself with theories. And it really relates to the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room here is China, and its attempt to use various mechanisms for influence within Australia, and you don't have to go the full Clive Hamilton to acknowledge that there certainly are a variety of means that the Chinese government and its agencies have used to influence Australian politics, not just Australian opinion, but Australian politics directly. Now, in many ways, and in Canberra, the context for this is in Canberra there's this so-called perennial battle for influence, but whether you call them hawks or doves or pro-China, anti-China, or national security realists versus the diplomats, and it waxes and wanes. The diplomats, of course, they want to smooth everything down and keep nice, and they're desperate to arrange more ministerial visits, and there's a lot of day-to-day work that you need to do to make sure that we can keep selling stuff to China. And I get that. And on the other hand, this bill came out of the work of the National Security Committee of the Parliament and the great articulate work of Andrew Hastie. My theory is that essentially the promulgation of the bill represented the high watermark of what you might those in the Hastie camp who are about national security and saying this we need to do this because of what China is doing. But then when it gets into the hands of the Attorney General's Department, which has probably the very highly qualified lawyers and legal brains who are not necessarily part of the national security establishment, all they're getting is messages that what we need to do is maintain the relationship with China. And if you're a bureaucrat thinking, do I want to be the person that blows up the relationship with China by writing letters to various Chinese businessmen, to Chinese government friendship associations, to the Chinese agency that sponsored the Lunar Festival in Chinatown in some Australian city? They're thinking, am I going to get cover from that from Christian Porter? Or maybe it'd be better if I just went around annoying Tony Abbott instead. Yeah. Because I actually think this is a systematic attempt to avoid the elephant in the room. Go, Chris.
Well, we don't know that. We don't know that because there have been notices sent out, and so unfortunately we don't know. And this is a job perhaps for the IPA to wield the awesome powers of freedom of information to find out who else have received these sorts of letters. But by and large, we don't know, and we do know that there is a list, and Morgan mentioned that something like 500 individuals or organisations as well. I think the bigger problem here is that the legislation that the Hastie camp, and maybe it's unfair to Andrew Hastie to pick him out on this, but the legislation that they wanted to write was shut down the Confucius centres. They can't write that legislation because it would look like they're targeting one specific country.
Yeah.
And so instead what they're trying to do is, okay, how can we we come up with general principles that will cover all the things that we are concerned that China might be doing. And it comes all the way down, and eventually they come down to a foreign organization that exists primarily to pursue political objectives. And now listeners might not be surprised to hear that, but we in the free market movement, we spend a lot of time working with our counterparts around the world to build a global free market movement, working with lots of foreign organizations that exist primarily to pursue political objectives. And that's not just fine, that's desirable. That's how we have a global movement towards liberty, how we can share ideas, how we can
if you define freedom as a political objective,
This is, well, but it is, isn't it? And the idea that suddenly we've got the Attorney General's Department has interest in the way that we think about freedom in Australia, I think is just obscene. Now, I understand that it comes from a concern about Chinese foreign influence, but in the absence of writing the Chinese Foreign Influence Act, I think this is very dangerous legislation that has been
the worst way to write.
I wanted to ask Bella what would have been the as we say in the AFL, the direct route to goal with the Confucius Institute.
Just shut them down.
Because these are they're partnering with universities.
They're partnering. It's the Chinese government partnering with universities directly,
which are creatures of generally state or federal legislation.
Yes. So can't we just? Didn't they do that in America? Haven't they shut down Confucius Institutes? And
some state governments have been involved. In other cases, say the University of Chicago, they've done it of their own accord. The New South Wales Department of Education is the only organisation I'm aware of in Australia that has actually taken that step.
So it is possible.
It is certainly possible. There might well be a term on the arrangements that they have. Perhaps the diplomatic route would be to simply let these things expire, but they could be nudged by certain ministers and governments.
I think they probably could. Well, I mean, Dan Tehan has started a task force and appointed a task force to do something about it. But I think that was about 2 or 3 months ago.
A task force?
Yes, and nothing's happened yet.
Well, why doesn't that surprise me?
I mean, obviously they need to focus on UQ, which seems to be the most deeply embroiled and problematic university when it comes to Confucius Institutes.
Bella, wasn't it at UQ where the nature of the relationship with the Confucius Institute had gotten so warm and friendly that they actually appointed the Consul General as an adjunct professor?
Adjunct fellow, professor of languages and culture.
Oh,
yes.
Oh, good. Oh, well, we all might start sponsoring universities then and see whether we can all become professors.
That would be very
nice. Not a bad gig if you can get it.
Yes, could work if you can get it. We might have to leave that there, but this is certainly one that has a long time. It's got to play out. We've seen Andrew Cooper has refused essentially to comply with the request from the Attorney General's department, so the IPA will certainly be following that and keeping an eye on it. But we do have other things to talk about, and part of it is some great research, Bella, that you've done about another arm of the Australian government, which is the Australian Research Council. Now, we're on YouTube. Can you hold up your report there, please, Bella?
Yes, I can.
This is called Humanities in Crisis.
Humanities in Crisis. An audit of taxpayer-funded ARC grants, with a lovely picture there on the front of the Raphael's School of Athens torn asunder to signify the humanities in crisis for people who can't see the image.
we'll extremely symbolic.
It's extremely symbolic.
Yes.
So this is my latest sort of hand grenade thrown into the universities, I suppose. One of many. I looked at,
and they're always so warmly received.
They love it.
In the spirit of open inquiry and discussion and debate.
I get job offers every day. It's amazing.
Adjunct professor
of culture and language. So I looked at 17 years of funding in the humanities, so subjects anthropology, criminology, something called human geography, historical studies, cultural studies, everything you can think of that is a study is funded by the ARC. So counted it all up, it is $1.3 billion in 17 years.
And for those listening on the podcast, Bella did put a finger to the corner of her mouth and say $1.3
billion total funding for all these subjects. And I drilled down and had a look at just the historical subjects, historical studies, because that's sort of where we've been looking for the last couple of years in our other reports. And I found that in 17 years they've funded 616 historical studies subjects, and that has come to an amount of 192 million.
And is there any sort of pattern,
let me think,
perhaps, that you might have identified in these various research grants?
No guesses as to the most popular theme in historical studies, which is, of course, identity politics, class, race, and gender. And this is 17 years worth, so this is not it hasn't come about suddenly. You can go back to 2002, 2003, and find these things. After identity politics, it's Indigenous studies and history. Remember that this is all of history. It's not just Australian history grants as well. So that's quite significant, I think, that's still a research priority. And then war and conflict is sort of the third most popular theme. But, it's not surprising. It's not surprising that they choose identity politics over anything else, because this is the way humanities is going and has gone and has been going for the last 17 years, and we seem to be coming up on the end of it, even though we've only been talking about it for the last 3 years. It's been around a while. I have obviously some of my favourite examples. I don't know if I should read them out.
Oh, I think we can have a few. Actually, I have one. More. I have one. You go, and then I'll see whether it matches my own favourite.
Well, I think the favourite so far has been Macquarie University. Is that your favourite?
Oh, dang, yes.
Yes.
That was exactly it.
Discovery Early Career Award, $391,685 for sexing scholasticism, Gender in Medieval Thought, 1150 to 1520. This project explores medieval theological debates about why it was necessary that Christ was born as a man. So,
I'd love to know the outcome.
Do we know why?
We don't know why.
Have we got a conclusion?
I'm going to have to look to see if anything's come out of it, which is obviously the other point of the fact that we don't know what came out of this research, because we never find out. The Australian public never finds out. We give them all this money. It's our taxes, and there's no discernible outcome or benefit for Australians. We don't know what they concluded.
Yeah, I think that's a trend across all sort of social sciences research. Is the idea that it's not meant to be read or cited or used in any sort of productive way. It's something that I would consider the culture of complete self-gratification in academia. The idea that you just do things for yourself.
Yes, it's very inward looking. And I'd argue that these academics who are in the humanities have a duty to talk about the Western. They have the privilege of spending their lives in academia. If they want to, they can just read Shakespeare for 15 or 20 or 30 years. The rest of us don't have that luxury. We have to go out and work. But they
hopefully wouldn't pay them to do that.
They're failing in their duty. They're failing in their duty to give us something give us value for money. And I think Morgan's right. It's very inward looking. It's very narrow. But that's what identity politics is, isn't it?
I wanted to point to this other example. I think it was in the last week or two, the second oldest university publishing house in Australia, UWA Publishing, announced that it would be shutting its doors. And it's no wonder why when you look at some of their recent publications. You have countless books on poetry. I saw a book that was dedicated to writing against Andrew Bolt, just dedicated to him as an individual. And autobiographical works from people who are only of note within the academic publishing world, and who seem to only be published in order to win prizes or perhaps chase further grants. But there's no sort of idea that you might be distributing this to the wider community, which happens to pay for it.
Yeah, it's.
But sure, surely we've got to decide what our critique. I mean, that's a public publisher, and the material may not be to everyone's taste, but at least that is an attempt to distribute that information. And there's an attempt to, I'm not defending their particular title list, but there's the idea that people are publishing out of the back of their academic work is desirable, and publishing in accessible environments. I think there's a really legitimate critique of academia, and it's one that I make a lot in while I'm in academia, in that people are not producing material that's accessible to the general public. The general public very often funds it, but then we can't turn around and also be angry when they try to do so.
Yeah, if what you're saying is, I too would actually support the idea of university publishing, and I think the fact that they're walking away from it, and it's not just at that university, but across the board, is not just because there's hardly any publishable works that anybody would ever buy a volume of, but it's reflecting a wider disconnection that the universities actually have with the society which supports them. It's not that society, that they should publish, endless encomiums of how wonderful Australia is, but some sense that they actually care about the things that Australians connect with, that they will explore the themes that and go deeper into issues that or historical questions or the literature of this country, or the wider Western tradition in which it sits. Instead, what we're seeing is this complete inwardness and this complete self-serving sort of research agenda, and why we even need research grants in the humanities is another question. We might need universities, but this whole ARC system is a joke. But yeah, they're turning their backs on the country.
And the thing that concerns me about the UWA thing is the continuation of the conversation that we had with I think it was Andrew and Zach a few weeks ago about the issue that academics aren't incentivised to study Australia. It's very hard to get studies of Australian policy, Australian history, Australian culture actually published in books, because the publishers aren't there as much as they used to be, and in good journals, or journals that the universities highly rate. And if the journal is highly rated, then that helps you build a better CV, which gets you a promotion and so forth. So there's a hell of a lot of the perversities in there. But I have to say, to return to the topic, one of those perversities is the fact that academics are expected to get these sorts of ARC grants. It's not just if you need the money to fund a Hadron Collider or something, or if you need the money for chemistry equipment, you should go and get a grant. No, there's an expectation that you just are getting grants.
Yeah, as your RMIT,
one who gets grants.
As your RMIT colleague Sinclair Davidson put it, the dirty little secret is that what other people would see as an input, which is an ARC grant, university sees an output. Like, what did you achieve this year?
Yeah,
I got this grant. And that
gets counted as research.
Yeah, that's the output. I got the grant. And look, it's such you're right, it creates terrible perverse incentives. Would we be any worse, really, Chris, if we just took the money? It's not insignificant, but I'll just forget about being a long-suffering taxpayer for a minute. Could we just hand it out more or less at random to universities, or hand it out pro rata to universities, and just let them deal with it? Why do we need the ARC to go through this charade of taking these ridiculous research proposals and handing them out to people who really shouldn't have been employed in the first place? At least if you gave it to RMIT, there's some accountability there.
Well, I'm not sure I want to give it to the organisations themselves, but I will point out there's a lot to be said about randomly allocating these sorts of grants.
Yeah.
The amount of effort that is put into the grants is just extraordinary. And I'm looking at some data from, it's a couple of years old now, and it's probably gotten a lot worse, preparing a new proposal for not actually the ARC, but the National Health Medical Research Centre, which is like the ARC but for medicine. That a individual grant takes 38 working days of researcher time and only has a 21% chance of success. Now, 21% is actually really high compared to the ARC, where we talk about grant success rates around 13% or so, or 11% depending on the specific scheme. So around the country, we are paying, and students are paying, academics massive amounts of money to chase grants that are very unlikely to be received, for the purposes really just of chasing those grants and spending huge amounts of time on it. It is a deeply, deeply perverse and destructive system if you care about scholarship, if you care about, well, getting bang for buck. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with the ARC, the ARC. It's just the waste in going for these ARC grants. So my personal preference would be randomly allocate them, and then skill at writing grants doesn't become a really key part of everybody's promotion strategy.
Yeah. No, good.
Sortition, precisely.
Yeah. And
Now,
if that means
there'll be some...
Yeah,
there'll be some kinks to work out.
Well, the output couldn't be worse.
I'd love to see the ones that don't make the cut.
Or they start. I'm sure we could give it to Endemol Southern Cross and have them, fund some kind of televised competition where you have like Shark Tank, where you actually go up before the panel, in front of a live studio audience.
Sell your idea in 5 minutes.
Oh man, why wouldn't
be amazing?
1% of the ARC's budget to do that.
Now, what that
and shoot, and you pull the lever, and
you should have just ordinary Australians judging.
Yeah. Sorry, Chris.
But what that system wouldn't do is, unless you had the ordinary Australians judging, what that wouldn't do is sort of reset the research topics, because the research topics, the government is not coming up with them, and the ARC is not coming up with them, but the researchers themselves are coming up with these topics, and of course it's senior researchers that are on the judging panels. But I think we need to come back to the fact that an ARC grant is technically a grant from a minister. The minister gives the grant. The ARC is an advisory body.
Yes, which
so when you read, when we read that a grant was handed out by a ARC grant was received by someone for finding out whether it was necessary that Christ was a man. Well, in fact, that's the education minister that handed out that grant. So whoever the education minister was in 2013, probably at that stage it was
Christopher Pyne.
This is why Simon Birmingham last year was perfectly entitled to veto, $42 million worth of grants, because he thought them that was his job. He thought them too ridiculous, and of course the academic community became hysterical and said that it was interference. But it's his job.
Yep. No, so good on him for that.
There's quite an amusing thing that's happened in the ARC space. And full disclosure, I have actually an application with the ARC at the moment on, of course, much more important work on blockchain research, which is going to do great things for the country if we get it. But there's an amusing thing that's happened now that Dan Tehan, the current education minister, has quite rightly realised that, in fact, these are grants from the minister. And why should I just let the ARC announce them? Instead, what he's doing is he's giving them to local MPs in the areas of the university and saying, you announce them. Because they are government grants. They are grants from the education minister to researchers. Why not use them as you would any other grant?
Oh well, just as they would hand it out for the local roads or the local schools. Now it's whatever local university gets a grant.
Exactly. If it's valuable enough to give, it's valuable enough to talk about.
Well, it's good to see someone's getting value out of the grants, even if it is only the government backbencher in a certain area. Since we're speaking about federal parliamentarians, we have been at the IPA, as everyone knows, looking for a long time at the questions of constitutional change to increase recognition in various forms for the Indigenous people of Australia, and we've been very much discussing the Indigenous voice to Parliament, and we recently released a video on the 31st of October. It was a video containing commentary from a wonderful lineup of Australians, including Senator James McGrath from Queensland, Dr. Anthony Dillon, who is a research fellow at the Australian Catholic University, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who's the Director of Indigenous Programs at the Centre for Independent Studies, and Lorraine Finlay, who's a lecturer in law at Murdoch University, which really spoke to the topical issue of a voice to Parliament. And the reaction to this video, Morgan, really told us something about where the debate is at the moment.
Yes, the idea that race might not have a place in the Australian Constitution continues to be an upsetting idea. I'll just highlight a few comments that stood out to me. I saw Kevin Rudd tweeted that the Liberals, and by the Liberals he means the IPA, I assume, just can't resist playing the politics of race. The opposition Indigenous Affairs spokeswoman Linda Burney called the arguments misleading and incendiary. Our political leaders have a duty to ensure this important national discussion is both civil and informed. I don't know what that means, but that sounds pretty creepy.
Yes, I mean the speakers in the video were nothing other than civil.
Absolutely,
absolutely. This is a debate about constitutional change, and we had sensible people explaining why they did not think that was a good idea.
Yeah,
and indeed that they thought it was divisive.
If the figures in that video are outside the bounds of civil and informed debate, then there'll only be one side of the debate presented. And finally, Ken Wyatt, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, expressed his quote-unquote disappointment that the IPA has engaged in bigotry by invoking the terminology of race. I would obviously reject that. That given the nature of the proposal, that acknowledging the reality that you are making a distinction between Australians on racial grounds and then implementing that distinction in either the Constitution or in legislation is honest, and we are not the ones. The IPA is not the ones invoking the concept of race. Chris, I believe you had some thoughts about this.
Yeah. So the Constitution invokes race in the Constitution right now. So what is remarkable about this is it's doubling down of a strategy that is remarkably new. So this debate has been going on for the better part of 5 or 6 years. The IPA has been involved in that debate for the better part of 5 or 6 years. When the IPA first started launching its campaign, race has no place. Race has no place refers to the fact that we also, or the IPA also, or Liberals also, want to get rid of mentions of race in the Constitution, of which there are 2, one of which is quite pernicious and one of which is bad optics. So the bad optics one is, of course, Section 25, which can be mostly removed and refers to concerns about Commonwealth statistics that are less salient these days. But the other one, of course, is the race power. And the IPA has called for the race power to be removed from the Constitution because race has no place. Now, since that debate about the Constitution has morphed into, in fact, we need this voice to Parliament, which is a relatively recent idea. Now, the idea that you would even be talking about getting rid of race in the Constitution has become apparently offensive, because now we only are allowed to talk about indigeneity being a descriptor for people who were there before settlers were there. Now, I'm not sure that that most Australians actually understand the distinction between indigeneity and race, but more fundamentally, it is completely separate from the debate we have been having for the past 6 years. Don't strengthen the race power to allow governments to do more in the in Aboriginal affairs. Abolish the race power.
Yes, and move away from measures which try to say that we're going to treat some Australians as separate and have their democratic representation achieved through a unique means, to be reckoned differently. I was looking back over Anthony Dillon's work, and of course he's got a strong body of work. Is that, as I mentioned, he's at Australian Catholic University, And the roots of why he participated in the video go deeper. He asked questions like, what is Aboriginal culture? A more fundamental question, what is Aboriginal? Who is an Aboriginal person? For someone whose great-great-grandfather was Aboriginal, do they count as Aboriginal? So you have these sorts of problems when it comes to culture. So, and he talks about, the role of culture, of ancestry. So he's talking about the very, very practical issues of what happens when you not only not step back from race, but actually use a race power, and you can call it indigeneity, but it's a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. He's saying these are the sort of issues that come up and you can't avoid them. So that's why the Voice to Parliament proposal particularly really highlights these issues of saying we're going to pick out certain Australians, and rather than saying we're all Australian and we can work together and we can address social issues and we can recognise the different cultures in this country, we're going to create this alternative mechanism. It may not be in the Constitution at first, but certainly many of the participants in this debate are saying, well, we'll accept the government legislating for it at first, and then we'll move to have it in the Constitution. So, as you say, if the measured, considered contribution of someone like Anthony Dillon is seen as beyond the pale of legitimate debate, well, I don't know how we can actually have any kind of debate.
There'll be no debate.
But it's because Wyatt and some of the other opponents don't want to reckon with the fact that this process has gotten wildly out of control. There's absolutely no way that this can be landed. When it began with a conversation about recognition and removing mentions of race from the Constitution. Now we are talking about a legislative separate body, or legislatively enacted separate body that may or may not get into the Constitution, that we are a long way away from where this process started as part of a reconciliation movement.
Oh, indeed. There is still a separate
grand legislative chapter.
There is still a separate process running for constitutional recognition, which is a separate process from the process for a legislated voice to Parliament. I mean, how any Australian is meant to actually make who's not working full time on this is actually supposed to make any sense of it all out of it is beyond me. I mean,
and they're not supposed to.
Well, unfortunately, to change the Constitution, you need to have a referendum. So that's
you do. But we're supposed to get by it just on good vibes, remembering the last good referendum of 1967. That, of course, no one can accurately describe what actually occurred. All these people wandering around saying it finally gave Indigenous people the right to vote, which is, of course, not at all what the 1967 referendum did. But we're just supposed to get the good vibes, we'll wave it through, and then we'll be reconciled.
Yes, well, good luck. Oh, and it's all meant to happen essentially in this term of Parliament, which would I think Morgan, Australia's foremost constitutional lawyer, you need a bill in Parliament to put up a proposal for a referendum. Yes, is that correct?
Yeah, no indication of that.
So
soon,
within this term of Parliament, there's going to be legislation for a referendum on recognition.
Yep.
And there's also going to be legislation for a voice to Parliament in this term of Parliament.
Apparently.
Boy, I'd love to go down to Ladbrokes and see what kind of odds I could get on either or both of those things happening. We have come to that segment of the show where we talk books and culture and get our wonderful panellists to share what they've been reading, watching or listening to. Now, I'm looking at Bella because she has a tremendous selection, which is something that anyone with access to Netflix can watch.
Yes, and if you do have Atflix, I was about to say Atflix to Netwatch, access to Netflix, you must watch The King. Which I missed. It was out in the cinema for about 2 weeks and I missed it. And it is it's brilliant. It's a Australian producer and an Australian screenwriter. And they've sort of done a bit of a mishmash of the Henriads of Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. They don't really follow the Shakespeare play very closely, but nonetheless, it's an absolutely brilliant production, and I was totally transfixed for the entire 2.5, I think 2 hours and 20 minutes. They stick loosely to the story of the boy who's living a life outside court, living this sort of debauched life with full staff, who then becomes king, and the transformation and the Battle of Agincourt and everything else. I won't wreck it for everyone, but it is phenomenal. And I really encourage everyone to watch that.
I talked about Harold Bloom, the great literary critic who only died recently in the Western canon. He talks about those books and, Falstaff, this, fat, jovial, venial, thief and drunkard, who was, genuinely friends with young Hal, but also, thinking about the main chance. Is one of the great characters of fiction, totally out, sort of outstripped even Shakespeare's control, once he'd created Falstaff, he sort of then lost control. It's a wonderful idea. But Joel Edgerton plays him in this and sort of dials it down a little bit.
He does, yeah.
And makes him more of a serious military person, in fact.
He dials him down. I mean, I don't want to give the plot line away, but he does dial him down. He's not a buffoon. He's not a buffoon, and he has a very different ending in the film to the actual play. It was the way they created that medieval world, the sort of the filth and the smell and the lack of, nobody was washing their hair. The king dying of sort of the pox, and you could almost smell
the open drains.
You could almost smell the open drains. And the costumes were fantastic. And it was produced by Brad Pitt was one of the producers, which I was really surprised about.
So Joel Edgerton's clearly moving in pretty exalted company in
But
Hollywood.
it did give me hope that people can still act and people can still put a really decent story together.
Excellent. And then you could always go back to the Kenneth Branagh or Laurence Olivier versions of Henry V, if you're so minded.
I saw the best ever production of Henry V at the Globe about 10 years ago, and I was a groundling. And one of the reviewers said that he was so convincing that all the groundlings wanted to follow him into battle, after the follow him out the Globe and into the streets of London to start
take on the French.
Exactly, to take on the French.
They should have run at the same time as a World Cup match. Could have got ugly. Chris, you wanted to talk about James C. Scott's book.
Yeah, so I read James C. Scott. It's a political scientist's book, Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States. This was actually published in 2017, but James Scott is one of my favourite authors, mainly because of his earlier book from 1998, Steeing Like a State. But anyway, so Scott's most recent book is Against the Grain, about the role that grain played in the development of state power and the role that grain played in moving, quote, civilization away from hunter-gatherer into these sort of large states. Grain is important for a bunch of reasons, but the real one that he narrows down on is grain is really easy to tax. It's really easy to be used as rations. And the need to grow grain made forced labor really central to state power. So he points out that early states are actually incredibly short-lived. And his argument is that when they collapse, that the descent into what we've described as barbarism or the Dark Ages was actually more like a return of freedom, given the amazing coercive taxation and forced labor powers that these early states imposed on their populations. And so the way you can think about this is very often we spend a lot of time looking at great archaeology. So I'm traveling through Europe at the moment. So I was in Athens last week and looked at, you do the Athens thing. So you visit the Parthenon and so forth. But those are big illustrations of state power. When I wanted to see a illustration of democratic order, you go to something called the Pinks, which is the place that they had the large voting assemblies on. And there are almost no visitors there. It's just this sort of flat field that's super important in the history of democracy. But that sort of the people power you don't really see. You only ever see the illustrations of large state control. Now, I don't think I buy everything in this.
So this is the idea that sort of what large-scale agriculture and irrigation, this is the old sort of theory that irrigation created the state in Egypt, and then that's why Egypt was that sort of had all the big temples, because they could actually extract the surplus from the poor old peasants.
James Scott seems to think this is a really new thesis, but it's actually quite an old one. And I remember reading Jared Diamond essays in the 1980s that have made precisely this claim. But what it is actually quite good at is pointing out that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is not necessarily a step back from civilization itself. It's just much harder to see in the archaeological record. Now, I'm still pro-agriculture and I'm pro-civilization and all that sort of thing, but it is nonetheless an argument that should be reckoned with when we think about the progress.
We've been talking about the Indigenous people of Australia, and one of the claims made is that for Indigenous people in hunter-gatherer societies, be they in Australia or South America or whatever, pre-contact with the West, that their lives got worse as they moved into modernity, or at that point of transition, things get much worse before they get better, and that's not an unreasonable claim. Does he also grapple with? Yeah, I think 4 hours a day was the famous claim, wasn't it? He only had to work 4 hours a day as a hunter-gatherer.
Yeah, look, and he certainly makes that. It does sound good, but it's very hard, of course, to have large families if you desire large families, or but even so, we have periods of history in which, say, industrialization causes lower health outcomes for the people who moved to the cities, because the 18th century London was grimy and disgusting and diseased and all that sort of thing. Yet nonetheless, people still made that choice. I think James Scott is most compelling when he points out that in fact people often weren't making the choice, because the thing about grain farming in the early states was you needed to force people to work on those farms, hence forced corvée labour or outright slave labouring. So I think there's a bunch of things that you have to tackle. It's one thing for you to make a choice to go to a city or go to a state to have a better life for yourself. It's quite another if the state is forcing you to do it.
Yeah, well, I remember being about 14, summer holidays on the tractor in the grain fields, thinking, I better get back to my books, see if I can study and get down to Melbourne as soon as I possibly can. Morgan, how about you?
So I'm usually the first person in a room to completely reject social media, but the credit for this culture pick actually comes from a former Looking Forward guest, Christian Kerr, who posted on Facebook the 37th, oddly enough, 37th anniversary of the release of an album by the 80s English pop band Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. And the name of their album was Architecture and Morality. And what I also found out from Christian was that this was named after a book by the high Tory architectural historian David Watkin. And I hadn't heard of this, and I was very excited to check it out.
Role
after I listened to the album, I read the book, and like the band, I suppose this book might have fallen down the memory hole, I suspect, but that shouldn't underscore its importance, or it shouldn't take away from its importance in sort of the architectural theory and architectural history in the 20th century. So I suppose I should just go through what it does. What Watkin does is he addresses the Hegelian illusion that all art and all thought and all institutions must be true to the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times, and in architecture this would mean that attempting to build in a style that wasn't from your current time period is by definition a retrograde step. So I suppose this is the modernist school of architectural theory, and it might not, I'm not too sure. It might not have been the first book to really challenge the modernist school, but I would argue that it wasn't the most powerful, and it's probably the most. It's had the best legacy in that the worst excesses of modernist architecture, like the brutalism, have since been rejected sort of en masse. They've fallen completely out of favour.
When did he write it, Morgan?
This was 1977,
okay.
I believe. So, yeah, which was really at the height of that sort of brutalist
that's
period.
When it was going up.
Yeah, exactly. So, I for anyone listening and you have access to a computer, quickly have a look at the High Court building.
Oh,
yeah.
I've got a better one.
Yes?
The Trellick Tower in London.
Okay.
Which is now listed, but it was designed by a Hungarian called Goldfinger, who actually inspired Ian Fleming. And it's still in London. It's become a landmark. It's an eyesore / landmark.
Yeah.
But it was this utopian dream of having everyone living in this commune, and it just turned into a crime scene essentially. Until people were able to buy their own flats, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, and they started looking after their own property.
Yeah,
that's one of the interesting things. So when we look at these brutalist buildings in the 2010s now, as they're just disgusting, but they've all been privatised. In fact, when they were building these brutalist monstrosities, they were actually trying to be driven by very complicated sort of quasi-socialist world view.
Yeah.
The design of the building was supposed to be de-individuating so that you would spend more time outside.
Yeah.
Dreadful.
And all these horrible. So it's not just ugly; it's also ugly and social engineering.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I was thinking about while reading the book. Actually, was the sort of diminution of the human spirit that comes across from this modernist mindset, and it's not just in architecture; it's in any sort of visual, artistic medium, in all painting or photography, cinematography, advertising, the kinds of people that are cast in films and television. Even the idea that not only is it not necessary to be beautiful or to strive for beautiful, but it's wrong or it's immoral to assert that things should be beautiful. The reason I was thinking of this just because
this is the classic white Western patriarchal view that there is this thing called beauty.
This is Sir Roger Scruton's view.
Absolutely.
Scrutinous view.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something should be beautiful.
Unashamedly. Well, the thing is that these are things that we have to engage with every day. We all have
to
live
in them.
We have to live and work in these buildings. We have to walk past these buildings. We have to wear the clothes, the fashions that are subject to these trends. We have to watch these advertisements. We have to be exposed to them. But the people that are making the rules about what they can be, say that rather than lift our spirits, they should not excite us. They should not amaze us. They should not make us happier to go about our day, days. I feel like it's a sadder world because we've rejected aesthetics.
But that book, on a positive note, it was part of a fight back, and I saw actually that there's a successor work called Morality in Architecture Revisited.
25 years after the original.
So he just built on the thesis.
And credit also should go to the Prince of Wales, who he's been a voice in sort of classicism in architecture and sort of an important voice against the worst excesses of modernism. But definitely, I would say David Watkin got the ball.
Even a stop clock can be right.
Yeah, well, maybe, but
I
will. But credit, I think David Watkin got the ball rolling, and it's a fantastic work.
Good work, and thanks to Christian Kerr for putting Morgan onto that. Something a bit more recent is another Netflix show, which is a documentary on Bill Gates. And it's called Inside Bill's Brain. It's very much an authorised look at Bill Gates. It's 3 episodes. It looks at his time building Microsoft, his childhood, and also his more recent incarnation working with his wife on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's certainly an interesting individual, and not just because he's stupendously rich, just unimaginably rich. And for those who are into the philanthropy, I do admire the foundation. He is trying to bring to that the the skills that he had in business. He's, for better or for worse, if he's going to do something like eliminate polio, he's funded not just the vaccines, but the new forms of geographic information systems that they can use in Africa. All sorts of programs. He's managing it in a very active way. He's not just handing over money. The thing so it's an interesting thing in its own right. The thing that got me was I had a pretty hazy idea of Bill Gates. I'd always sort of had the view that he'd sort of fluked it a little bit. He just happened to be the guy who wrote DOS, and DOS was pretty useful, and they got that contract with IBM, and away he goes. But it does look like he was actually a bit of a prodigy, and he is a compulsive worker. He reads a heck of a lot. If this documentary is to be believed, he's always worked very, very hard. He basically left his original business partner behind in the dust because this guy wanted to have a life. Played the guitar and things like that.
People sort of refer to Bill Gates as someone that dropped out of college as like, you don't have to work hard, but no, he worked extraordinarily hard. Exactly.
Yeah, I had thought that too. It's like, college dropout, isn't that interesting? Yeah. But the reason why was he didn't need to finish. No. He'd already started the business. He was hired as a consultant while he was still in school. Yeah. The local college approached him and his friend because they couldn't do their class schedule for the forthcoming semester. And they knew they wanted a computer to do it, but no one at the college knew how to program a computer. So they hired these 15 and 16-year-olds to do the programming, which, spat out that, 4,000 students go into 300 different classes with 75 different lecturers and all the, in X number of rooms. And so he's a clever bugger. He is actually a clever bugger, works ridiculously hard. And came from a very solid family. His mother coached him to actually interact with humans a little bit. That was one of the things his mother did. So I think we will. So I think it restores a bit of your faith in capitalism, in entrepreneurship, in the sense that yes, sometimes there are just these unique individuals with above average capacities, above average work ethics, above average ability to build a business. And build an ethos. He had his ups and downs. It does make me admire him a lot more. When I was in the US in last year, I looked at all the workshops of Edison, and I think 100 years' time we'll be looking back on Bill Gates in and thinking about him in the same way that we think about that heroic age of inventors, because what he's built is remarkable.
What he doesn't have is the sort of brand management of the Steve Jobs, but he's a nicer guy, as I understand, much nicer person.
Yes.
Jobs is a terrible one.
No, that's right.
But he doesn't have that vibe, and he doesn't have that cool vibe. He also alienated a lot of people because he was a very early proponent of intellectual property protection for software, and he was very angry with computing communities for pirating his software, but absolutely he and of course he focused very much on enterprise as well. So he was the capitalism side of the digital revolution. So for all those reasons, he's become sort of the not cool version against the cool Steve Jobs.
And without going through the whole show, he does talk about when they launched antitrust action against him. About a browser, like when we look back on it now and we just think this is just lunacy. That the key to the internet and computing and everything was whether or not they preloaded Internet Explorer. But he made an ass of himself. With the I think it's the FCC, with Congress. He took the load on himself and came across as an arrogant turd, basically. And they talk about that. Meanwhile, everyone loves Steve Jobs because he's wearing a skivvy and he's really cool and his computers look nice.
It's very, and they're all so pretty.
That's right, aren't they pretty? But anyway,
and he's a terrible bloke.
Happens to be an awful human being who barely talked to his own family. But go figure. So there's another good one to watch. Don't forget that Looking Forward, which you have been listening to, is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. To access our research, please do go to ipa.org.au, where you can also find out how to join or donate if you haven't already done so. A big thank you to our panellists today. First of all, Chris Berg from Spain.
Thank you, Scott.
Anything in Spanish you'd like to say?
Muchas gracias.
Very good. Morgan Begg.
Sure.
Thank you. No Spanish from me.
Yes. And, of course, Bella De Brera.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bella. And, of course, a big thank you to our producer, Josh Stranger. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.